The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Kensington Palace as Princess Charlotte walked slowly toward the garden gates. Her small hands trembled slightly as she clutched a crumpled letter, the words inside having shattered her world just hours before. At only 9 years old, Charlotte had always been the spirited one among the royal children, full of laughter and mischief that brought joy to everyone around her. But, today, her usual bright smile was nowhere to be found. The letter had arrived during breakfast, delivered by a stern-faced courier who had insisted it was urgent. Charlotte's governess, Mrs. Henderson, had read it first, her face growing pale as she absorbed the contents. The message was simple but devastating. Charlotte's beloved grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, had taken a sudden turn for the worse during the night. The doctors were not optimistic about her recovery. Charlotte had begged to see her grandmother immediately, but the adults around her had exchanged worried glances and spoken hushed tones about appropriate protocols and security concerns. They told her she would have to wait, that arrangements needed to be made, that a child her age shouldn't be exposed to such distressing situations. But Charlotte knew in her heart that waiting might mean never seeing her grandmother alive again. The Queen had always been Charlotte's confidant, the one person in the royal family who truly understood her free spirit. While others tried to mold Charlotte into the perfect princess, always reminding her to sit straighter, speak softer, and smile more demurely, her grandmother had encouraged her curiosity and independence. During their private tea times, the Queen would share stories of her own childhood adventures and tell Charlotte that being royal meant having the courage to do what was right, even when others disagreed. As Charlotte walked through the palace corridors that morning, she could hear the frantic whispers of staff members and the constant ringing of telephones. Everyone seemed to be preparing for something terrible, but no one would give her straight answers about her grandmother's condition. The uncertainty was eating away at her, and she knew she couldn't just sit in her room waiting for news that might never come. Standing at the garden gates, Charlotte looked across the grounds toward the main palace building where she knew her grandmother lay ill. The distance seemed impossibly vast, and, between her and the Queen stood layers of security, protocol, and adult authority that seemed determined to keep them apart. But Charlotte had inherited her grandmother's stubborn determination, and she was not going to give up without a fight. She noticed Sergeant James Mitchell standing at his usual post near the garden entrance. James had been assigned to the royal security detail for 3 years, and, in that time, he had watched Charlotte grow from a precocious 6-year-old into the thoughtful young girl she was today. Unlike many of the other guards who maintained strict professional distance, James had always treated Charlotte with genuine warmth and respect. He would often engage her in conversations about her school projects or listen patiently to her excited stories about new books she had read. James came from a working-class family in Manchester and had joined the Royal Protection Service after serving in the military. He understood the importance of duty and following orders, but he also had a younger sister back home who was close to Charlotte's age. This personal connection had given him a unique perspective on the challenges facing the young royals, who often seemed trapped by the very privileges that others envied. As Charlotte approached the gate, James could see the distress written across her face. Her usually perfectly styled hair was slightly disheveled, as if she had been running her hands through it anxiously, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. She was still wearing her casual morning clothes, a simple blue dress and white cardigan, rather than the formal attire usually required for any public appearances. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," James said gently, offering a small bow. He had learned to read Charlotte's moods over the years and could tell immediately that something was seriously wrong. Charlotte looked up at him with desperate eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "James, I need your help," she whispered, glancing around to make sure no other staff members were within earshot. "It's about Granny. She's very sick, and they won't let me see her." James felt his heart clench at the pain in the young princess's voice. He had heard the rumors circulating among the staff about the Queen's condition, and he knew that the situation was indeed grave. The entire palace had been on high alert since the early morning hours, with additional security measures being implemented and senior officials arriving for emergency meetings. "I know this must be very frightening for you, Princess," James said softly, crouching down to her eye level. "But I'm sure the adults are just trying to protect you. These situations can be very difficult, especially for someone your age." Charlotte shook her head vigorously, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "You don't understand, James.
Granny needs me.
She told me once that when people are very sick, having family close by can help them feel better.
What if she's scared and alone right now? What if she's waiting for me to come, and I'm just sitting here doing nothing?
The conviction in Charlotte's voice struck James deeply. He could see that this wasn't just a child's tantrum or a desire to get her way. This was a granddaughter's desperate love for someone who meant the world to her, and her frustration at being powerless to help when it mattered most. James had always admired Charlotte's compassionate nature. He had witnessed numerous occasions when she had shown remarkable empathy for others, whether it was comforting a crying child during a charity visit or expressing genuine concern for staff members who seemed troubled. Despite her privileged upbringing, Charlotte had developed a deep sense of connection to other people's emotions and experiences. "Princess, I understand how much you love your grandmother," James said carefully, aware that their conversation could be overheard by other security personnel. "But there are protocols in place for these situations. The medical staff needs space to work, and there are security considerations to think about as well." Charlotte stepped closer to James, lowering her voice even further. "Please, James. I know you're not supposed to help me go against what the adults have decided, but this is different. This might be my last chance to tell Granny that I love her. What if she dies thinking that I didn't care enough to try to see her?" The question hit James like a physical blow. He thought about his own grandmother, who had passed away when he was in the military, serving overseas. He had been unable to return home in time to say goodbye, and the regret had haunted him for years. The idea that Charlotte might carry a similar burden for the rest of her life made his chest tighten with emotion. James looked around the garden, calculating the various security measures and potential obstacles that would stand in their way. What Charlotte was asking was not just against protocol, it could potentially cost him his job and his entire career in security. The Royal Protection Service operated under strict guidelines, and any deviation from established procedures was taken extremely seriously. But, as he looked back at Charlotte's pleading face, James found himself thinking about something beyond rules and regulations. He thought about the human side of this situation, a young girl's love for her grandmother and the possibility that rigid adherence to protocol might create a tragedy that could have been avoided. "Princess," James said slowly, "what exactly are you asking me to do?" Charlotte's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. "I need you to help me get to the main palace. I know all the secret passages and back stairways, Granny showed them to me during our exploration games. But I can't get past the outer security checkpoints on my own. If you could just help me get inside, I could find my way to her room from there." James felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Everything in his training told him to refuse, to escort Charlotte back to her quarters, and to report this conversation to his superiors. But something deeper, a voice that sounded remarkably like his own grandmother's wisdom, whispered that some things were more important than following orders blindly. He thought about the Queen herself, whom he had observed during various official functions. Despite her formal public persona, James had noticed the genuine warmth in her interactions with her family, especially with Charlotte. He had seen the special bond between grandmother and granddaughter during informal moments, and he understood that their relationship transcended royal duties and public expectations. "Princess, if I were to help you, and I'm not saying I will, but if I were to help you, you would need to promise me something very important," James said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. Charlotte nodded eagerly, ready to agree to almost anything if it meant reaching her grandmother. "You would need to promise that once you've had a chance to see your grandmother, you would allow me to contact the appropriate people and ensure that you're returned safely to your family's care. This can't become a situation where you're missing for hours and people are worried sick about your safety." "I promise, James. I just need to see her and tell her I love her. That's all. After that, I'll do whatever you think is best." James studied Charlotte's face, searching for any sign that she was being manipulative or dishonest. But all he saw was raw, genuine emotion and a maturity that seemed to have aged her beyond her years in the span of a few hours. Making a decision that would change both their lives, James stood up and looked around the garden one final time. "Princess, if we're going to do this, we need to be very smart about it. There are cameras, other guards, and security protocols that we'll need to work around." "Are you absolutely certain this is what you want to do?" Charlotte wiped away her tears and stood up straighter, channeling the same regal bearing that her grandmother had displayed during decades of public service.
Yes, James. I've never been more certain of anything in my life.
Granny would do the same thing for me if our situations were reversed. James nodded slowly, already beginning to formulate a plan in his mind. He thought about the shift changes, the blind spots in the security coverage, and the various routes through the palace complex. It would be risky, potentially career-ending, and definitely against every rule in the book. But, looking at Charlotte's determined face, James realized that some rules were meant to be broken when love and family were at stake. "All right, princess," he said quietly.
"Let's go see your grandmother."
As they began walking toward the palace, neither James nor Charlotte could have imagined the events that their decision would set in motion, or how their act of defiance would ultimately touch the hearts of people around the world. What started as a simple plea for help was about to become a story of courage, love, and the power of human connection to transcend even the most rigid institutional boundaries. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky as they made their way across the grounds, two unlikely allies united by a shared understanding that sometimes doing what's right matters more than doing what's expected. Behind them, the empty garden gate stood open, a symbol of the boundaries they were about to cross in their quest to reunite a granddaughter with the person who meant everything to her. James checked his radio one last time, knowing that once they began their journey, there would be no turning back. Charlotte walked beside him with quiet determination, her small hand unconsciously reaching for the crumpled letter in her pocket, the letter that had started this entire adventure. Neither of them spoke as they approached the first security checkpoint, both understanding that their success would depend on careful planning, quick thinking, and, perhaps a bit of luck. The palace loomed ahead of them, its ancient walls holding within them both tradition and the possibility of change. Somewhere in those halls, a beloved queen lay ill, unaware that her granddaughter was moving heaven and earth to reach her side. And, somewhere else in those same halls, adults were making decisions based on protocol and procedure, not yet realizing that a 9-year-old princess and a dedicated guard were about to rewrite the rules of what it meant to put family first. As they reached the edge of the garden, James turned to Charlotte one final time. "Are you ready, princess?" he asked softly. Charlotte looked up at him with eyes that held both fear and hope in equal measure.
"I'm ready," she whispered back. "Let's bring Granny and me together."
And, with that simple declaration, their extraordinary journey began.
The first obstacle came sooner than James had anticipated.
As they approached the main courtyard, he spotted Sergeant Williams manning the central checkpoint, his eagle eyes scanning everyone who passed through the area. Williams was known throughout the Royal Protection Service for his strict adherence to protocol and his unwavering dedication to following every rule to the letter.
If anyone would question their presence together, it would be him.
James felt Charlotte tense beside him as they drew closer to the checkpoint. He could sense her nervousness, but he was impressed by how well she was controlling her emotions. The princess had straightened her shoulders and adopted the composed expression he had seen her use during formal royal events. Despite her young age, Charlotte understood the importance of appearing confident and purposeful.
"Remember what we discussed," James whispered quietly.
"You're on your way to retrieve a book from the library for your afternoon lessons.
I'm simply escorting you as part of my regular duties."
Charlotte nodded almost imperceptibly, her training in royal etiquette serving her well in this moment of deception. She had been taught from an early age how to maintain composure under pressure, though she had never imagined using those skills for something like this. As they approached Williams, James maintained his usual professional demeanor while silently praying that the older sergeant wouldn't ask too many questions. Williams looked up from his paperwork and nodded respectfully to Charlotte before turning his attention to James.
"Bit early for library visits, isn't it, Mitchell?"
Williams asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp and observant. "Princess Charlotte has some additional research to complete for her afternoon tutor session," James replied smoothly. "She wanted to get an early start on her studies." Williams glanced at Charlotte, who offered him a polite smile that betrayed none of the turmoil she was feeling inside. "Very commendable, Your Royal Highness. Education is indeed important, especially in times like these." Charlotte felt a chill at Williams' words, wondering if he knew something about her grandmother's condition. But she simply nodded graciously and said, "Thank you, Sergeant Williams."
I do try to take my studies seriously. William seemed satisfied with their explanation and waved them through the checkpoint.
As they walked away, James could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The first hurdle had been cleared, but he knew there would be many more challenges ahead.
Once they were out of William's earshot, Charlotte whispered, "That was terrifying." I thought for sure he was going to ask more questions.
"You did perfectly, Princess," James replied quietly.
"Your composure was exactly what we needed. But we need to keep our guard up. The next checkpoint will be more challenging because it's closer to the medical wing."
As they walked through the palace corridors, Charlotte couldn't help but notice how different the atmosphere felt from usual. There were more people hurrying through the hallways, their faces tense and worried. Staff members who would normally greet her with warm smiles barely seemed to notice her presence, too focused on whatever urgent tasks they had been assigned.
The palace itself seemed to echo with an unusual energy.
The normally pristine corridors buzzed with quiet activity as housekeeping staff moved efficiently from room to room, preparing for what Charlotte suspected might be an influx of important visitors. She had witnessed similar preparations before during state visits and major royal events, but this felt different, more somber and urgent. James led them through a series of less frequently used passages, drawing upon his extensive knowledge of the palace layout that he had acquired during his years of service. He had always made it a point to familiarize himself with every corridor, stairway, and exit, understanding that thorough preparation was essential for effective security work.
As they climbed a narrow service staircase, Charlotte asked softly, "James, do you really think we can do this? What if we get caught?"
James paused on the landing and turned to face her.
"Princess, I won't lie to you. What we're doing is risky, and there could be serious consequences for both of us.
But sometimes in life, we have to choose between playing it safe and doing what our hearts tell us is right.
The question is, do you still believe this is worth the risk?"
Charlotte thought about her grandmother lying alone in a hospital bed, possibly wondering why her family hadn't come to see her. She thought about all the times the Queen had comforted her during difficult moments, offering wisdom and unconditional love that had helped shape Charlotte into the person she was becoming. The answer came to her immediately.
"Yes, James.
It's worth any risk.
Granny has always been there for me when I needed her. I can't abandon her now, even if adults think I should." James smiled at the determination in her voice. "Then, we keep going.
But we need to be extra careful from here on. We're about to enter the section of the palace where security is much tighter." They continued their journey through corridors that Charlotte had never seen before. James explained that these were service passages used by staff members who needed to move through the palace without disturbing official activities. The walls were plain white rather than decorated with the ornate artwork found in the public areas, and the floors were simple linoleum instead of polished marble. "I never knew these passages existed," Charlotte whispered in amazement. "It's like a secret world inside our own home." "Every large building has passages like these," James explained. "They're practical spaces that allow the real work of maintaining the palace to happen behind the scenes. Your grandmother probably used similar passages when she was younger and wanted to move around without formal escorts." The mention of her grandmother brought Charlotte's focus back to their mission. She quickened her pace, eager to close the distance between herself and the medical wing where she hoped to find the Queen. As they approached the next checkpoint, James held up his hand to signal Charlotte to stop. Ahead of them, he could see 2 guards stationed at a security station that controlled access to the medical facilities. Unlike Sergeant Williams, these guards would have explicit instructions to prevent unauthorized access to the area where the Queen was being treated. "This is going to be more difficult," James murmured. "These guards will have specific orders about who can and cannot enter the medical wing."
"We need a different approach."
Charlotte peered around the corner and studied the guards. One of them was Corporal Thompson, whom she recognized from various palace events. Thompson had always been kind to her, often sharing stories about his own children when they encountered each other during official functions.
"What if I just asked them directly?"
Charlotte suggested.
"Corporal Thompson knows me, and he's always been nice. Maybe if I explained the situation." James shook his head immediately. Princess, these guards are following direct orders from their superiors. No matter how much they might sympathize with your situation, they can't simply ignore their instructions. We need to find another way. James studied the area carefully, looking for alternative routes or opportunities to bypass the checkpoint entirely. His military training had taught him to always assess multiple options when facing an obstacle, and he applied that same methodical thinking to their current challenge. There's a maintenance corridor that runs parallel to this hallway, he said finally. It's used by the engineering staff for accessing electrical and plumbing systems. If we can reach it without being seen, we might be able to bypass this checkpoint entirely. How do we get to the maintenance corridor? Charlotte asked, trusting James's expertise completely. James pointed to a door about 20 feet behind them. That door leads to a supply closet, but there should be an access panel in the back wall that connects to the maintenance area. The challenge is reaching that door without attracting attention from the guards. They watched the guards carefully, timing their movements and conversation patterns. James noticed that every few minutes, both guards would focus their attention on paperwork or their radio communications, creating brief windows of opportunity when someone might pass unnoticed. When I give you the signal, we're going to walk quickly but quietly back to that supply room door, James instructed. We need to move like we belong here, not like we're sneaking around. Can you do that? Charlotte nodded, drawing upon the confidence she had cultivated during years of public appearances. She understood the importance of projecting authority and purpose, even in situations where she felt uncertain. They waited for the right moment, watching as both guards became engaged in a radio conversation that seemed to require their full attention. James tapped Charlotte's shoulder, and they began walking casually back down the corridor toward the supply room. Charlotte's heart pounded so loudly she was certain the guards would hear it, but she maintained the steady pace James had instructed. She focused on breathing normally and keeping her expression neutral, just as she had been taught during media training sessions. They reached the supply room door without incident, and James quickly opened it and ushered Charlotte inside. The small room was filled with cleaning supplies, extra linens, and various maintenance equipment. In the back corner, just as James had hoped, there was an access panel that led to the building's service infrastructure. This is where things get a bit more challenging, James warned as he examined the access panel. These maintenance corridors aren't designed for comfort. They're narrow, sometimes dark, and will need to be very quiet because sound can carry through the building's ventilation system. Charlotte looked at the small opening with determination rather than fear. I don't care how uncomfortable it is, James. If this gets us closer to Granny, I'm ready. James carefully removed the access panel, revealing a narrow corridor lined with pipes and electrical conduits. He shined his flashlight into the space, checking for any obvious obstacles or hazards. The passage was cramped but navigable, and it appeared to run in the direction they needed to go. I'll go first and help you through, James said. We'll need to move slowly and carefully. These passages weren't designed for people to use regularly, so we need to be mindful of where we step and what we touch. James crawled into the maintenance corridor, his broad shoulders barely fitting through the opening. Charlotte followed behind him, her smaller size making navigation somewhat easier. The space was indeed cramped and dimly lit, with only James's flashlight providing illumination. As they made their way through the corridor, Charlotte tried not to think about the dust and cobwebs that were probably getting on her clothes. Her usual concern for maintaining a proper appearance seemed trivial compared to their mission. All that mattered was reaching her grandmother. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them, branching off in various directions that led to different parts of the palace's infrastructure. James consulted a mental map he had memorized during his security training, guiding them toward what he hoped would be an exit point near the medical wing. How much further do you think? Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible even in the confined space. Not much longer, James replied quietly. I can see light ahead, which should indicate another access point. We just need to make sure we emerge in a safe location. As they crawled forward, both of them were acutely aware that their adventure was far from over. They had successfully bypassed the first major security checkpoint, but they still needed to reach the Queen's location and, then,
figure out how to approach her without alerting the medical staff or security personnel who would surely be monitoring the area. Charlotte's determination never wavered, but she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were attempting. The palace that had always been her home suddenly felt like a fortress designed to keep people apart rather than bring them together. Yet with James's help, she was discovering that even the most formidable barriers could be overcome when love and determination worked together. Behind them, the access panel remained slightly ajar, evidence of their passage through the building's hidden infrastructure. Ahead of them lay uncertainty, challenges, and the hope that their journey would ultimately lead to a reunion that might not otherwise be possible. The narrow corridor stretched onward, carrying them deeper into their adventure and closer to a moment that would test not only their courage but also the very foundations of royal protocol and family love. The maintenance corridor finally opened into a utility room adjacent to the medical wing. James emerged first, carefully checking that the area was clear before helping Charlotte climb out. Her dress was now dusty and wrinkled, and there was a small tear in her cardigan from navigating the tight passages, but her eyes still burned with determination. "We made it," Charlotte whispered, brushing dust from her hair.
"Are we close to Granny now?"
James nodded, but his expression had grown more serious.
"Princess, this is where our journey becomes truly dangerous. The medical wing is the most heavily secured area of the palace right now.
There will be doctors, nurses, family members, and additional security personnel.
We need to be incredibly careful." Through the utility room's small window, they could see into a corridor that buzzed with activity. Medical equipment lined the walls, and staff members in white coats moved purposefully between rooms. The atmosphere was tense and focused, with everyone clearly aware that they were dealing with a situation of utmost importance. Charlotte pressed her face to the window, searching for any sign of which room might be housing her grandmother. "There are so many people," she observed quietly. "How will we ever get through without being noticed?"
James studied the layout of the medical wing, drawing upon his security training to assess the situation. He noticed that most of the activity seemed concentrated around a corner room at the end of the corridor, likely where the Queen was being treated. Between their current position and that room stood multiple obstacles: roving medical staff, posted security guards, and family members who would immediately recognize Charlotte. "Princess, I need to ask you something very important," James said, turning to face her directly.
"Are you absolutely certain you want to continue?
Once we step out of this room, there's a very good chance we'll be discovered.
When that happens, there will be consequences for both of us."
Charlotte looked at James with eyes that seemed far older than her 9 years.
"James, what if this is the last time I could ever speak to Granny? What if she dies tonight, and I never got to tell her how much she means to me?
Could you live with yourself if that happened?" The question hit James deeply. He thought about all the times in his own life when he had chosen safety over courage, protocol over heart. He thought about the regrets he carried from missed opportunities to connect with the people he loved. Looking at Charlotte's determined face, he realized that some moments in life were worth any risk.
"All right, Princess. But we do this my way, step by step.
If I tell you to stop, you stop immediately.
If I tell you to hide, you hide without question. Our only chance of success is if we work together perfectly. Agreed?"
"Agreed," Charlotte said solemnly, extending her small hand for a handshake that sealed their partnership. James carefully opened the utility room door and peered into the medical corridor. A nurse was walking away from them toward the main nurses' station, and 2 security guards were engaged in conversation near the elevators. The timing wasn't perfect, but it might be their best opportunity. "We're going to walk confidently down this corridor like we belong here," James instructed.
"If anyone stops us, I'll do the talking.
Your job is to stay calm and let me handle any questions." They stepped into the medical corridor, and James immediately felt the weight of surveillance. Security cameras tracked their movement, and several staff members glanced in their direction with curiosity. Charlotte walked beside him with remarkable composure, her royal training serving her well even in this extraordinary situation. Halfway down the corridor, a senior nurse approached them with a puzzled expression.
"Excuse me, Sergeant Mitchell," she said, reading James's name tag. Is there some kind of security concern? This area is supposed to be restricted to essential personnel only. James felt his pulse quicken, but he maintained his professional demeanor. I'm conducting a routine security assessment of the area, Nurse Patterson, he replied, reading her identification badge. Princess Charlotte is accompanying me to observe security procedures as part of her education in palace operations. Charlotte stepped forward slightly, offering the nurse a polite smile. I'm learning about how the different parts of the palace work together, especially during important situations. Sergeant Mitchell thought it would be educational for me to see how medical and security staff coordinate their efforts. Nurse Patterson seemed momentarily taken aback by Charlotte's articulate explanation, but her expression remained skeptical. I'm not sure this is appropriate timing, Your Royal Highness. The medical wing is dealing with a very serious situation right now. I understand completely, Charlotte replied with a maturity that surprised even James. That's exactly why this is such a valuable learning opportunity. I want to understand how dedicated professionals like yourself handle challenging circumstances. James watched in amazement as Charlotte employed diplomatic skills that would have impressed seasoned royal advisors. The princess was drawing upon years of training in public relations and social interaction, using her natural charm and intelligence to navigate this delicate situation. Nurse Patterson appeared to be wavering in her resolve to stop them. Well, I suppose if it's for educational purposes, but you must stay with Sergeant Mitchell at all times, and you cannot interfere with any medical procedures. Of course, Charlotte agreed readily. I would never want to disrupt the important work being done here. As Nurse Patterson returned to her duties, James marveled at how Charlotte had handled the interaction. The princess had shown remarkable poise and intelligence, transforming a potentially disastrous encounter into a minor inconvenience. They continued down the corridor, drawing closer to the room where James suspected the Queen was being treated. The activity around that particular area was indeed more intense, with additional security personnel and what appeared to be senior medical staff consulting in hushed tones. As they approached, James recognized Dr. Sarah Morrison, the Queen's personal physician, emerging from the room with a troubled expression. Dr. Morrison had been treating the royal family for over a decade, and James knew that her presence indicated the seriousness of the Queen's condition. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat as she saw Dr. Morrison. The reality of her grandmother's illness suddenly felt more immediate and frightening. Up until this moment, part of her had hoped that the adults were overreacting, that her grandmother's condition wasn't as serious as everyone seemed to believe. Dr. Morrison noticed them approaching and paused in her consultation with a colleague. Princess Charlotte, she said with surprise. What are you doing in the medical wing? I thought your family had decided to keep you away from this area until we have more certainty about your grandmother's condition. Charlotte felt tears threatening to overwhelm her, but she fought them back with every ounce of strength she possessed. Dr. Morrison, please. I need to see Granny. I know everyone thinks I'm too young to handle this, but she's my grandmother, and I love her so much. I just want to hold her hand and let her know I'm here. Dr. Morrison's expression softened as she saw the genuine anguish in Charlotte's eyes. As a medical professional, she had witnessed countless family situations, and she understood the profound impact that emotional support could have on both patients and their loved ones. Princess, your grandmother is very ill, Dr. Morrison said gently. She's been in and out of consciousness, and we're not certain how much she's aware of what's happening around her. But she might know I'm there, right? Charlotte pressed. Even if she can't respond, she might be able to hear my voice or feel my presence? Dr. Morrison glanced at James, clearly understanding that this visit was not officially sanctioned. But she also recognized the depth of love between Charlotte and her grandmother, and she had seen firsthand how much the Queen cherished her relationship with her granddaughter. The medical evidence does suggest that patients can sometimes sense the presence of loved ones, even when they appear unconscious, Dr. Morrison admitted. And your grandmother has mentioned you frequently during her lucid moments over the past few days. Charlotte's eyes lit up with hope. She's been talking about me? Yes, dear. She's been asking when she'll be able to see you again. She's been worried that you might be frightened or confused about her illness. James watched this exchange with growing emotion.
He could see how much Charlotte needed this connection with her grandmother, and he could also see that Dr. Morrison was beginning to understand the importance of facilitating their reunion. "Dr. Morrison," Charlotte said with quiet dignity, "I promise I won't get in the way of any medical procedures. I just want to sit with Granny for a few minutes and let her know that I love her. Please don't make me wait until it might be too late." Dr. Morrison looked at Charlotte for a long moment, clearly wrestling with protocol and compassion. Finally, she sighed deeply and glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard by other staff members. "Princess, if I were to allow you to see your grandmother for a brief visit, it would have to be under very specific conditions. You could not touch any medical equipment, you would need to stay calm regardless of what you observe, and you would need to keep your visit short to avoid disrupting her rest." Charlotte nodded eagerly, agreeing to any conditions that would allow her to see the Queen. "And, Sergeant Mitchell," Dr. Morrison continued, turning to James with a knowing look, "I assume you understand the irregularity of this situation and the potential complications it might create?" James met her gaze steadily. "Yes, Dr. Morrison. I understand completely, and I take full responsibility for any consequences that may result from this decision." Dr. Morrison studied them both for another moment, then made a decision that would change the course of their entire adventure. "Very well. Follow me, but we need to be extremely discreet. If anyone asks, you're here for a brief, authorized family visit that was arranged through proper channels." As they followed Dr. Morrison toward the Queen's room, Charlotte felt her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and fear. In just a few moments, she would see her beloved grandmother, possibly for the last time. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, but she knew that she would rather face that fear than live with the regret of not trying. James walked behind them, acutely aware that they were now completely dependent on Dr. Morrison's willingness to bend the rules in the name of family love. Their adventure had taken them far beyond anything he could have planned or controlled, but somehow it felt right. They were no longer just breaking protocol, they were affirming the most fundamental human connections.